The sky grew dark, and the wind howled with a ferocity that shook the trees in the small town of Millhaven, Maine. Sarah had just finished her shift at the local grocery store when the storm hit, and she was relieved to be inside and safe from the raging tempest outside. But then something strange happened. As the storm raged on, a thick mist began to descend upon the town, covering everything in an eerie grey haze. Sarah peered out the windows of the grocery store, trying to make sense of what was happening. As the minutes ticked by, the mist became thicker and denser, until it was impossible to see anything beyond a few feet. The storm had passed, but the mist remained, an impenetrable barrier that seemed to separate Millhaven from the outside world. Sarah realized that she was trapped inside the store with a group of strangers, all of them just as bewildered and frightened as she was. They huddled together, trying to make sense of what was happening and what they should do next. The power flickered on and off, and the sound of the wind howling outside was punctuated by strange noises, like something scratching at the walls of the store. Sarah's heart raced as she realized that they were not alone. Something was out there in the mist, something that was not of this world. The mist was not just a weather phenomenon. It was a harbinger of something much more sinister. And as Sarah and the others huddled together in the grocery store, they knew that they were in for a long and terrifying night, one that would test their will to survive and force them to confront their deepest fears. As the mist outside grew thicker and the sound of scratching at the walls grew louder, the group of survivors in the grocery store realized that they were not alone. Something was out there, lurking in the mist, and it was hungry. Sarah and the others tried to make a plan, to figure out how they could survive until help arrived. But the creatures in the mist were relentless, attacking with a ferocity that seemed almost supernatural. One by one, the survivors began to fall, taken by the monsters in the mist. The tension inside the grocery store was palpable, as the survivors began to turn on each other, blaming one another for their predicament. As the hours ticked by, Sarah and a few others decided to venture outside, hoping to find help and discover what was causing the mist and the creatures. It was a risky move, but they knew that they had no other choice. As they stepped out into the mist, they were immediately confronted by a nightmarish world. Giant insects crawled across the ground, prehistoric monsters roamed the streets, and terrifying creatures that seemed to be from another dimension lurked in the shadows. Sarah and her group were forced to fight for their lives, battling the creatures and trying to make their way through the mist to safety. The journey was harrowing, and they lost more members of their group along the way. But finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they stumbled upon the remains of a destroyed town, and there they discovered the horrifying truth about the mist. It was not a natural occurrence, but was instead the result of a secret government experiment gone wrong. Sarah and her group were horrified by what they had discovered, and they knew that they had to do something to stop the experiment and escape the mist before it was too late. But they were running out of time, and the creatures of the mist were closing in on them fast. As Sarah and her remaining companions reached the outskirts of the destroyed town, they saw something that made their blood run cold. A military installation loomed in the distance, and they knew that it was the source of the experiment that had unleashed the mist and the monsters. Determined to stop the experiment and escape the mist, Sarah and her group decided to sneak into the installation under cover of darkness. It was a dangerous plan, but they knew that it was their only hope. As they crept through the darkened halls of the installation, they saw horrifying sights that made them question their sanity. There were twisted experiments being conducted on both humans and creatures, and the scientists responsible seemed to be completely insane. But Sarah and her group pushed forward, determined to stop the experiment and save themselves and the survivors back in Millhaven. They finally found the control room, where they confronted the deranged scientist in charge. A tense standoff ensued, with Sarah and the scientist engaging in a deadly game of cat and mouse. But finally, Sarah was able to destroy the experiment and shut down the machinery that was causing the mist. With the experiment destroyed, the mist began to dissipate, and the monsters began to retreat. Sarah and her group were able to escape the installation and make their way back to Millhaven. where they discovered that a few survivors had managed to cling to life in the grocery store. As they emerged from the mist, Sarah and her companions were changed forever. They had survived a horrific ordeal that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, but they had also proven their bravery and resilience in the face of unimaginable horror. Sarah and her group quickly set to work, searching for any survivors and trying to piece together what had happened. They found a few others who had managed to survive in various parts of the town, but the majority of the population had been killed by the creatures in the mist. As they worked to clear away the debris and tend to the wounded, Sarah and the others struggled to come to terms with what they had experienced. They were haunted by the memories of the monsters and the mist, and they knew that they would never be the same again. But despite their trauma, Sarah and her companions were determined to rebuild their town and move forward. They knew that they would never forget what had happened, but they refused to let it define them. In the weeks and months that followed, the survivors of Millhaven worked tirelessly to rebuild their community. They found strength in each other, and they refused to let the memory of the mist and the monsters defeat them. As the town began to come back to life, Sarah and the others knew that they had survived something truly horrifying. But they also knew that they had proven their resilience and their ability to overcome even the darkest of situations. And as they looked toward the future, they were determined to never forget the lessons that they had learned in the mist. As time passed, the survivors of the mist in Millhaven continued to work together to rebuild their town and their lives. Sarah and her companions formed a tight-knit community, bound together by their shared experiences and their determination to move forward. But even as they rebuilt, they couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. They knew that the experiment that had caused the mist and the monsters had been just one of many being conducted around the world, and they feared that it was only a matter of time before another disaster struck. Determined to prevent another catastrophe, Sarah and a group of her companions began to research the experiments and the organizations responsible. They discovered a vast network of secretive organizations and corporations, all working to harness the power of science for their own gain. As they delved deeper, Sarah and her group discovered a disturbing truth. The experiments that had caused the mist and the monsters were just the tip of the iceberg. There were countless other projects being conducted, with potentially even more disastrous consequences. Determined to put an end to the madness, Sarah and her companions formed a resistance group, working to expose the truth and put a stop to the dangerous experiments. It was a dangerous mission, and they knew that they were putting themselves at risk. But they also knew that it was the only way to prevent another disaster from occurring. As they worked to uncover the truth and fight against the powerful organizations, Sarah and her companions realized that they were not alone. There were others who shared their beliefs and their determination to make a difference. Together, they formed a movement, spreading the word and working to raise awareness about the dangers of unchecked scientific experimentation. And slowly but surely, they began to make a difference. As the years passed, the movement grew, and the organizations responsible for the experiments were forced to answer for their actions. Sarah and her companions had made a difference, and they knew that they had prevented countless disasters from occurring. Looking back on their experiences in the mist, Sarah and her companions knew that they had been changed forever. But they also knew that they had used their trauma to create something positive, and to make a real difference in the world. And as they looked toward the future, they knew that they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead.